What I would like to do in my remarks, since there are two global compacts, the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration, is to direct most of my remarks to the Global Compact on Refugees. In some ways, it is the more developed compact. And let me begin by pointing out that we are seeing, in historical terms, one of the worst periods in terms of forcible displacement since the Second World War. The number of people in absolute terms is at its highest level. By the end of 2020, UNHCR estimates that there were some 82 million forcibly displaced persons worldwide. Many of those, of course, are refugees, but the largest number are actually internally displaced persons, and then a large number of asylum seekers. And these typically, I think, as we all know, are individuals fleeing persecution, conflict, violence, failures in governance, human rights violations. And the cases, I think, are all very familiar to us. In Syria, roughly half the population being forced to leave their homes. In Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya refugees who fled to neighboring Bangladesh. In our own hemisphere, almost 5 million Venezuelans who've fled into neighboring countries as a result of a massive failure of governance in their country. In sub-Saharan Africa, roughly a quarter of the world's refugees are based in sub-Saharan Africa, many of them in neighboring countries. I think, as we all know, in Afghanistan, a new tragedy is unfolding with the return of the Taliban. The current refugee system, which was created and really designed out of the Second World War, I think it's fair to say it's not able to meet the challenges we face today. Having said that, both the Global Compact on Refugees and the new Global Compact on Migration are two exercises in international regime building that are attempting to strengthen international norms and promote stronger cooperation among countries to deal with the challenge of people who are on the move. Turning to the Global Compact on Refugees, there really were four major objectives in the compact. They're laid out in paragraph 7. And they are as follows: to really help the pressures that refugee hosting countries, that many of which are actually in the neighborhood, immediate neighborhood of the country where people are fleeing, to ease the enormous pressures those countries are under, to enhance self-reliance of refugees, to expand access to what are sometimes referred to as third country solutions, other places where refugees can be resettled, and ultimately to support conditions in the country of origin so that people can go home. The compact has come under some criticism. It's been criticized for being biased towards rich countries in the developed world. That's something we can obviously talk about later. I'm just laying out what some of the arguments are. I think it's fair to say that the rise of populism and anti-immigration policies in Europe and the United States has certainly made access to third country solutions more difficult. We see that almost on a daily basis along the southern border of the United States, even under a new administration in Washington. And when it comes to meeting the needs of refugees and the challenges of resettlement, those needs are simply not being met. According to UNHCR, less than 5% of global refugee resettlement needs are being met. There are a number of what I would call or characterize as ongoing challenges. I think the default solution, and I would put that in quotation marks, is tends to fall in the local neighborhood. Countries like Turkey, Jordan, Syria, Pakistan, Iran, Bangladesh, Uganda are bearing the brunt of the burden when it comes to meeting the needs of those who've been forcibly displaced. In many cases, it's very difficult to integrate refugees into local labor markets and to integrate them into the local society. Having said that, much of the policy and academic work, and there's some major studies that have been done, show that when labor market reforms are introduced, migrants and refugees are important drivers of economic growth and welfare in host countries, provided governance arrangements are taken to incorporate them into the local economy. So integration is the answer. It's often hard to achieve. There are many social, economic, political obstacles to it. But at the end of the day, if those obstacles can be overcome, those who have been forcibly displaced are major contributors to the economy and society of the host countries in which they find themselves. Oops. Sorry. Now, notwithstanding the existence of the Global Compact, in fact, the two Global Compacts, there's still an enormous amount of work that needs to be done at the international level. For example, the principle of responsibility sharing, which is articulated in the Global Compact, shows that, and I've mentioned this already, that refugee receiving countries are bearing a disproportionate share of the costs of helping those who've been forcibly displaced. And many countries are not fulfilling their obligations under the Refugee Convention to accept refugees in their country. We see that in Europe, we see that in the United States, we see that in other parts of the world. And it may be time to think about a new set of, a new principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. That is a principle that we have in the Climate Change Convention. And it's a pretty simple principle. If you're not prepared to accept refugees for whatever reason, you should be stepping up to the plate with money, with assistance, with other resources to help those countries that are meeting their obligations. The principle there is everybody's got to pitch in. But if you're not prepared to take people, you better be prepared to do something else. And that principle is I think evolving in the European Union context, but it does mean bringing pressure on those countries who are not prepared to take those who've been forcibly displaced to do a lot more. When it comes to the issue of resourcing and money to help refugee communities, I think it's fair to say that we need a much broader based network that goes well beyond UNHCR, that involves the global financial machinery to help in a much more concerted way refugee hosting countries. I'm going to say a bit more about that. And I think we can all agree that when it comes to host society engagement of refugee populations, when it comes to the way international institutions work, we need more meaningful avenues and forums for participations by refugees themselves in the machinery of both international governance, but also at the national level. The way we finance the humanitarian response to what have been a succession of refugee crises is it's a bit like a charity ball. The plate gets passed around, but it's probably time to certainly when it comes to UNHCR to go to a system of assessed contributions. We do that in the area of peacekeeping. Levies are placed on countries based on obviously their ability to pay to ensure that those especially when it comes to UNHCR funding targets are met. In the World Refugee and Migration Council, we've done a lot of work on this. You can find it on our website, but there are a lot of creative instruments when it comes to offering trade concessions, developing new kinds of financial instruments such as refugee bonds, equity investment funds that can be used to really help the economies of refugee hosting countries, especially in the developing world. 85% of all refugees are in the developing world and developing countries. To give them a leg up so that they can grow their economies, and it's not just the refugees who benefit from that, but also the local population. There are a number of very creative ideas, and it's a pity that Senator Omadvar can't be with us today, because she has introduced a bill in the Senate that I understand she'll be reintroducing when the new parliament convenes, to go beyond Magnitsky legislation, which freezes the assets of the bad guys, if I can use that term, and the elites in many countries that perpetrate refugee crises, the decision makers are often up to no good when it comes to purloining the assets of public accounts. The Assad regime, for example, in Syria has hundreds of millions of pounds that are stashed away in banks in the United Kingdom and Switzerland. They're sitting there frozen under Magnitsky laws. But our idea is that you would take some of that money through a court-ordered process and repurpose it to help the primary victims of their actions, and those are the refugee populations who've been you know, literally thrown out of the country. What I don't have on the slide here is another proposal that was actually in the party platforms of both the conservative and the liberal governments, to create an international anti-corruption court. Well, why is that important? Failures in governance, acute failures in governance and corruption, grand corruption, and we certainly saw that in Afghanistan, have been responsible in part for you know, people with the collapse of governments being forced to flee. So the idea here is to have an international anti-corruption court that would you know, allow countries, especially those where there's a weak rule of law, for individuals to come forward to you know, prosecute those who are raiding the public purse, as a way of strengthening governance. And that these are both instruments to, you know, tackle what we would call some of the deep-rooted causes of forcible displacement, one of which is bad governance, bad leaders, which whose actions contribute to the failure of the state. So to summarize, going beyond the compacts, which, and don't get me wrong, I think the Refugee Compact, it was won through a hard series of negotiations, but like any international exercise, sometimes you don't get as much as you want and you're forced to the lowest common denominator. But one can build on the work of those compacts. It will take countries like Canada to take the lead. Building, for example, a global action network for the forcibly displaced. One of the things, in fact, we're doing through the work of the World Refugee and Migration Council is to create a global women's leaders network of refugee women leaders who are working with refugees in their home countries. And a network is exactly that, giving them the tools, web-based platforms so that they can share ideas, share best practices, and mobilize. Some argue that you know, at some point we're going to have to bring the 1951 Refugee Convention up to date in terms of how we define a refugee. A lot of discussion now about, you know, how do we deal with so-called climate change refugees, which is a problem we're already beginning to see as climate change affects marginal populations who are forced to leave their countries. Strengthening systems of accountability through, in effect, going beyond Magnitsky, to send a very strong message to those leaders who are responsible for forcing people out of their countries that it's going to hit them in the pocketbook if they continue to misbehave in such an egregious fashion. On the finance trade side, getting creative when it comes to trade preferences, refugee sovereign bonds to help refugee hosting states. Something I haven't talked about, but you know, online service providers are offering some of their platforms to help refugees. Airbnb, for example, is helping refugees through its platform. But I think, again, having met with some of the folks in Silicon Valley, there's a lot more we can do there, particularly in making platforms available, not just for communication, but for entrepreneurship and microfinancing. There's a lot more that we can do there to you know, empower refugees and give them online tools. where connectivity exists to help them start earning their livelihoods.